Testing.
Hi there, David.
Hey, Matthew, how are you?
Good. So obviously this is new for all of us, and so we want to just jump in and hopefully this will work and we won't have to redo it. I don't actually see you though right now.
How about right now?
Bingo.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
So this is for my anthropology class. So I don't know if you're going to want to use this too. Probably not. And maybe I'll come to yours later today or some other time. But I'm here with David Price. David and I go back to undergraduate years. We were both together in the old days. And we both graduated in 1984, and we had the same advisor. I was doing cultural change studies on Japan and China, but you were helping with looking at the bones of the Green River murderer, weren't you? And doing forensics.
Yeah, doing archaeology and forensics.
And then you went on to do a degree in cultural anthropology from University of Florida, I believe, working with Marvin Harris.
That's correct. Yeah.
And working in Egypt.
Working in Egypt. I started working in Yemen, looking at irrigation, and then it became politically impossible. I waited over a year for a visa that never came, so I just took the money and went to Egypt.
So you have background in archaeology and cultural anthropology. But the reason why I think you're so interesting to talk to is because you've done all this incredibly innovative archival research on anthropologists, which is itself been very widely read and very influential in our field in terms of understanding the role of the discipline and our relationship to organizations like the FBI and the CIA and anthropology in general, is connection to colonial endeavors and Vietnam War and so forth. So maybe you can give us a little overview of this innovative research.
Sure. Did you just let a dog out?
Yeah, exactly.
When the dog comes back in, you have to pick it up so we can all see. So.
Yeah, you want to see my dog when he comes back.
Yeah, when the dog comes back. Yeah, so I sort of stumbled in to that sort of historic work. I don't really know for sure where the roots came from. Maybe from just a general sense of paranoia and figuring we weren't getting the straight story. But you know, over the years, I knew so many anthropologists doing field work that had stories about weird things going on in the field, where agencies like the CIA might approach them. And I got curious about whether or not it was possible to use the Freedom of Information Act and archives to document these different sorts of relationships. So a long time ago, like quarter century ago, 25 years ago, I started just using the Freedom of Information Act to ask for records from the FBI and CIA, State Department, Department of Defense on anthropologists. And when I started, I didn't know what I was doing. I just wrote letters and asked for things, and I'd get my claims rejected, and they'd say, well, you have to prove the person's dead, and so I'd send an obituary, and you know, over time I started to get files. And well, when I started, I was looking for connections between anthropologists and military and intelligence agencies. But the surprising thing I found, especially from the FBI, is I started getting tons of records about McCarthyism and the McCarthy period. McCarthyism's in the 1950s. Um, there was a red hunt. The feds went after people on the political left claiming they were communists. And I'd had no idea that there were dozens and dozens of anthropologists that were focuses of FBI surveillance, largely because they were working on issues of race and racial equality. And so I started getting all these FBI files, some of them 500, 700 pages long, that showed all of these anthropologists were being monitored, or sometimes worse, by the FBI for engaging in politically unpopular work, which was fighting for racial equality.
So how did that lead to this work with the so that led to your work with looking at the anthropologists actually working for the CIA?
Yeah, well, it became really clear to me that maybe what I was working on was this sort of Cold War project, looking at how anthropology interacted with the Cold War, sort of a memory project, sort of rethinking this stuff. And so I got good advice from the anthropologist Laura Nader, who said, she told me, look, half of your story is going to be very sympathetic to anthropologists being victims during the Cold War. The other half, people might be less comfortable with anthropologists collaborating with intelligence agencies in the Cold War. So Laura Nader said, smartest thing you could do is first tell the sympathetic story first. And I had the most information. So I wrote a book called Threatening Anthropology that told the story of these anthropologist activists. And so then I got back to working on what I thought would be this sort of CIA book, looking at the different ways that anthropologists and intelligence community interacted. And the more I worked on that, I had this one opening chapter that was about World War II, because it became clear to me you couldn't explain why anthropologists would willingly give information to the CIA and other agencies until you understood what anthropologists did in World War II. And that first chapter accidentally became a book called Anthropological Intelligence, that used all of these documents, archived documents, and Freedom of Information Act things from FBI and Department of Defense and such, to tell the story of all this work anthropologists did in the war. Over half of American anthropologists worked for the war effort. And of course, it was a really different war than the sorts of wars we see now. It was a war against fascism. And given the threat to humanity that fascism brought, it makes as much sense as anything that anthropologists would get involved in it. And they did all sorts of things. They were translators, they ran language programs. They were the only people who'd been out to these far corners of the world and knew the geography, knew the culture. But they were also things like spies. There were anthropologists who worked for the Office of Strategic Services, OSS, which later became CIA after the war. So they also worked in the internment camps, the Japanese American camps run by the War Relocation Authority. And in my very opinionated view, about half of them did what I'll call bad stuff, tried to make the internees more legible and controllable in the camps. But the other half were activists that were fighting for their rights. So it was this, and that's sort of the story of the war. There were people at the end of the war who thought anthropologists had done a great thing. And there were people at the end of the war, like Gregory Bateson, who really raised questions about should he have done everything that he did during the war. So once I got done with that, I got back to the larger sort of CIA Cold War book. And what I tried to do in that book is tell as complicated a story as I could, showing how anthropologists who had been fighting, some of the most serious bad guys, certainly the most serious bad guys of the 20th century, the Nazis. To me, it's very understandable why they would have done what they did in the war. And it's understandable why in the late 40s, early 50s, as the CIA was starting up, they wouldn't have seen a break or distinction. This was work they'd done in the war, even though, in my view, the cause was really different. The cause of World War II was, I think, very clearly liberation, whereas the political causes in the Cold War got all sorts of messy, and of course, the United States wound up being sort of occupiers or the colonial, more on the colonialist side than not. So in that work, I found lots of documentation of anthropologists doing things like briefings, right? If somebody came back from, Sarawak or somewhere, some part of the world that is not that well known to the State Department, there would be these friendly sort of briefings that, make sense, but it really complicates ethically and politically what the role of anthropologists are. So I found, I found all sorts of information I didn't think I would be able to find when I started that project. So that's sort of the big picture overview of where I've wandered.
Which, by the way, most people watching this don't realize I worked in Sarawak, so that you mentioned. And when I never was approached by the CIA, but I kind of always wondered whether I would be, and they didn't. But I was brought in by people in the Sarawak government privately and quietly, and they pulled me into the government offices and said, "We're not going to tell anyone we've asked you these questions, but can you tell us honestly what's going on with the logging and stuff?" They wanted to know. They didn't really understand. They were concerned about the environmentalists being upset about the logging, and they were concerned about the logging. They really didn't know where it was happening, and they knew that I was out there in the jungle. And so they started asking me detailed questions with maps.
Yeah,
and they wanted to know about ideas for development projects and what was feasible and where they might put a hospital or a road. And so that was really, really interesting. It wasn't anything really bad about that. They just wanted to get input.
And I think that's sort of what the majority of stuff was. When I lived in Egypt, I lived out in the Fayoum Oasis, which is politically, it's always been an interesting area. It's where the blind cleric Sheikh Abdul Rahman, the first time somebody tried to blow up the World Trade Center, his people, that's where he's from. And it has a large Christian population, over 20% of Coptic Christian. And while I was there, a couple villages away, there was an incident where a Christian shopkeeper was burned alive. And there were accusations he was a child molester and things like that seemed more political than, I don't know, than real, just in terms of what was going on. And a few weeks later, I was working in an archive in Cairo for a couple days. And the men in black appeared. These guys in suits came and said, "Oh, we understand, you're living out here. What do you know about that?" And I didn't know anything. And I acted like I knew less than I did. I don't know anything. I just learned about it from the newspaper, which is basically true. But that sort of stuff happens. And I was trying to see, is there a pattern? Everybody has these sorts of stories like yours. What does it mean? And yeah, I like what you said about yours. It's like, I didn't tell them anything that they shouldn't know, and I didn't tell them anything that wasn't basically public sort of information. But it shows sort of the unique position that anthropologists have historically been, of being out there in the backcountry, for lack of a better word, having info.
So what's your next project?
Right now, I'm muddling around in a project looking at the Asia Foundation. The Asia Foundation still exists, but it started in 1951 with a different name. And in 1967, it was revealed that they were running on CIA money, and it was a private foundation. And they stopped taking CIA money that year or the next year. They needed some money to sort of a bridge loan. But they were like Fulbright or any of these other reasons.
They actually brought people from Sarawak to the United States to get educated.
Yeah, no, that's what they do, is these exchange programs. And so I found out a couple of years ago that they got exposed by the New York Times in March 1967. And like I say, they quit taking money then. And I figured out a couple of years ago that Stanford, the Hoover Institution at Stanford, wound up with like 480 linear feet of their documents. So I had a sabbatical a couple of years ago and got some money from Stanford. I live in Olympia, Washington. I'd take the train down, do these 2-week trips, and just, photograph the hell out of the collection. I could do, 10,000 pages of documents, just photographing them in 2 weeks, and then take the train back up and work through them and go back. So I'm doing a book on that that's really muddled right now. Yeah, and one of the difficulties is I know the CIA stuff really well, and I can spot what's going on. I am certainly not an Asianist, so I need to get it in good shape and have people like you and other people who understand what I'm missing read it, because I'm sure I'm getting all sorts of stuff wrong. So it's an ongoing project, let's say.
So do you see yourself as a historian of anthropology or an anthropology of anthropology? Like what's your, I know your discipline is anthropology, but you kind of really are doing history of our field.
Yeah, I would prefer to be the second, but might accidentally be becoming the first. I don't really know. After Matthew and I were colleagues together at Evergreen. Evergreen State College is where we were undergrads, and after that, I went to University of Chicago and got my master's degree and got the hell out of there. It was not for me for all sorts of reasons, but largely living in the big city, and it was taking people like 15 years to graduate from there, and I couldn't see doing that. But the year I was there, I worked with George Stocking, who's really the historian of anthropology, and learned a lot from him, even though our approaches are very, very different to the subject.
Anyway, well, it's an unusual project. I mean, and you've been at it for what, 20 plus years. And how many books? 3 books are out now?
Yeah.
4. Yeah. So anyone interested in your work can clearly find it and read it. It's really sheds light on our discipline, and I appreciate you coming into class in this time of cyber learning.
Cyber learning, so, exactly.
Yeah. All right. Well, thanks so much.
Thank you. It's good to see you, Matthew. Take care.
All right.
Cheers.
Bye-bye.